In the mid-1960s, the world's smartest TV producers brought together 4 young musicians to create a TV show that was years ahead of its time. I'm talking, of course, about the Monkees. And you, comedy, music, pop culture nerd, probably love the show, but don't realize it. That's why I, Monkees superfan Takuro McCullough, sit down with a variety of guests to watch every Monkees episode and discuss their glory on the Monkees podcast. Whether you're already a fan or have never seen an episode, the Monkees podcast is for you, as we discuss the Monkees phenomenon, hilarious antics, and deep fandom. So check it out at monkeespodcast.com, that's PAWDCAST, or wherever podcasts are found.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
And welcome back, Quillers, to another episode of your favorite quilling podcast, Don't Quill the Messenger. Today in studio, we have with us again as our special guest, one of our most popular guests, and I think today will mark a record for the most appearances on Don't Quill the Messenger. Dr. Earl Showerman is here with us again. And today we're going to be talking about one of my favorites, and I know it's one of yours favorites as well, Earl, especially because it's set in Athens. Yes. And that is A Midsummer Night's Dream. Probably the most popularly produced Shakespeare play of all time. I don't know for a fact that that's true, but I would be willing to wager dollars on that one. If it's not that, it's got to be Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet, but certainly the most popular comedy of them all.
I think definitely so. And there has been more translations into foreign languages of A Midsummer Night's Dream than any other play of Shakespeare's.
Now, see, I wasn't aware of that.
I went to an international Shakespeare conference, and we were talking about Midsummer Night's Dream, and they mentioned that was one aspect of this play that was so universally appealing that it had been translated into more languages than, again, any other play in the canon.
You know, I have a copy of a version of Julius Caesar that's in all Italian, and there's a great film out there that is set in Italy, and it's sort of a docudrama that these guys go into an Italian prison and put on a production of Julius Caesar using the inmates from the prison. I can't think of the name of it right now, but it's a fabulous piece. And you hear Shakespeare in Italian, but I've never actually seen a production in a foreign language. And you saying that makes me think, wow, I wonder what A Midsummer Night's Dream sounds like in Chinese or Swahili or, you know, some other very exotic language. It'll be interesting to see a production in a foreign language. Have you ever seen a production in a foreign language?
I have not, except they did a comedy of errors that was mostly in Spanish at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival last year as part of their program of reaching out to the Latina population in our region. And so I have seen that. And I do know that in 2016, the Globe Theatre in London put on a whole series of foreign language editions of Shakespeare's productions and brought in companies from all over the world that would produce the plays in their native languages. So I think that is a very interesting phenomenon. And in Italy in particular, did you know that Mussolini rewrote Julius Caesar and put on a production of it in a giant plaza in Rome? And he was an adapter of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar.
The crazy fascists, you know, Hitler and his art, Mussolini and Shakespeare.
Hitler had a collection of Shakespeare complete works. And in Himmler's diary, he actually refers to the fact that Hitler had thought that Shakespeare was so much greater than the great German poets like Goethe or others that he said Shakespeare gives us Shylock and The Merchant of Venice, and what does Goethe and those? They give us Isaac the Wise, who negotiates peace between the Jews, the Muslims, and the Christians. So the fascists did have a certain love of certain plays, and Caesar being number one, and of course Hamlet being the other play that they
it's
really
kind of
liked.
Incredible how people claim Shakespeare as their own, no matter what the circumstances are, you know. And I know most people who are Shakespeare files have seen Throne of Blood,
Yes.
Which is the Japanese version of Macbeth. So that's a pretty famous one. And I have seen that, but it's also not a translation, it's an adaptation, so it's a little bit different.
Well, it doubles down because the Oregon Shakespeare Festival about 10 years ago did a production of The Throne of Blood, which was an English adaptation of Kurosawa's film. So it goes in both directions, Stephen.
Could you imagine A Midsummer Night's Dream in German? I can't even imagine what that would sound like. It's such a guttural language. I can't even imagine that would sound beautiful to listen to. But anyway, here we are. We're going to talk about Midsummer Night's Dream. Let me share with you my quick opinion as to why that play is so popular. I believe it happens to be one of the most accessible of them all as far as audiences being able to follow the characters, follow the storyline, understand what's going on. And even though there is a lot of flowery language, and I use that word on purpose because I think there are more references to flora and in that play than any other. But it's even though it is, this Elizabethan language that sometimes people say, well, I can't understand Shakespeare. For some reason, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, you are able to fully understand almost everything and the imagery of it all. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes. It's an original story, an original script. Nobody has identified a specific, unique one source for the primary plot of the young romance between Hermia and Lysander and Demetrius and Helena and the lover's plot or the marriage plot between Theseus and Hippolyta. So there's an eclectic collection of classical, medieval, and Renaissance sources that Shakespeare has cobbled together in a unique mosaic of sources to create this magical story. And I think the fact that you have a substantial portion of the play focused on the rude mechanicals, which is totally a farcical, burlesque kind of style of theater, that the opportunities for comic relief through various bizarre episodes is greatly enhanced. So I think the fact that you have three separate groups going on at different times in different places, actually four if you include the fairy world, creates a marvelous weaving. And of course, Bob Bottom was a weaver.
Yes, isn't that interesting? And I think, and I could be wrong about this, but if it doesn't set the precedence for satire of actors, then I'm not sure what would predate it. But it's certainly, Shakespeare poked at everyone. And in this play particularly, he pokes at the very artists who he requires to bring his works to the public. And I think, that's just who he was. Nobody was off limits, even the people that he needed the most to help him accomplish his goals. And I love the play from an actor's standpoint because everything that is bad about actors is epitomized in this play.
Well, certainly among the rude mechanicals, and Bully Bottom is the archetype of burlesque. There's no question about that. And you really touched on an important point that I think is going to be part of this discussion here. And I would refer people to an article that I wrote in Brief Chronicles, which is available on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. It was published in 2015 in Brief Chronicles 6. The title of that one is Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare's Aristophanic Comedy. And the reason I named it that is because the whole scenes with the rude mechanicals in Titania are a in-your-face political allegory that's mocking Queen Elizabeth's obsession with the French Duc d'Alençon, who was born Hercule de Valois, later rechristened as Francois Hercule de Valois. But when Bottom says, I could play Heracles rarely, or a part to tear a cat in to make all split, and then he goes on with that little doggerel shout out, the raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks on prison gates, and Phoebus's car shall shine from far and make and mar the foolish fates. It is a hysterical moment.
It's lofty. This was lofty.
You got that. But what he's doing is he's paraphrasing John Studley. He's mocking and paraphrasing John Studley's 1571 translation of Seneca's Hercules Ateus. So he's mocking Studley's translation, which is rather archaic compared to Shakespeare's poetics device. He's also drawing attention to how Phoebus has tricked the fates, and that's a reference to Euripides' Alcestis. So you have the Bottom claiming to play Hercules, with references both to Studley's translation of Seneca and Euripides' Alcestis, all in one short doggerel kind of speech. But when he's saying I could play Hercules rarely, he's referring to the fact that he's actually playing Hercule Valois, the Duke of Alençon, and Titania is now cast as Queen Elizabeth's stand-in.
I always point to that fact, and I say absolute fact, unquestionable fact, that that's what's happening there. And I always point to that as one of the key factors that we should consistently play upon when we talk about who could have possibly gotten away with that kind of mockery of the queen and her potential husband at the time.
Right. Well, this is 10 years, of course, after the romance. So we don't know precisely when Midsummer Night's Dream was written. There's been speculation that it probably was produced for a royal or a noble marriage sometime in the mid-1590s. E.K. Chambers and other scholars have speculated on the various possible venues in which it was produced. Some have suggested that it was the marriage of Elizabeth Vere, the Earl of Oxford's oldest daughter, to William Stanley, the Earl of Derby. Some have said it's Thomas Heneage marrying the dowager widower Mary Brown, the dowager widow of Southampton. Other noble marriages have been suggested as possible sources for that. So you can imagine that writing a political satire that mocked the queen and her French lover during, a period 10 years after it was all over was quite remarkable. And the courtiers who were present at that first production would have really been aghast at the hysterical opportunities. Bottom, for instance, calls out the fairies, Monsieur Mustard Seed, go fetch me the honey bags. Monsieur so he uses the word Monsieur 10 times in 13 lines. Well, Alençon was called Monsieur. He negotiated the Treaty of Monsieur in 1576. He was known as the younger brother of the French king. His appellation was Monsieur. So when Bottom uses that term over and over and over again, I think he's very much pointing at himself. Titania, as a stand-in for Elizabeth, is, of course, association with Diana. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, Titania is an alternative name that Ovid uses in the Latin original for Diana. And, of course, Queen Elizabeth was associated with Diana. And there's a point at which Titania is taking Bottom away with his ass's head, and the fairies are in tow with her. And she mentions something about when the moon weeps, all the little fairies weep with her. Mm-hmm. Well, the night that Queen Elizabeth agreed to marry the Duke of Alençon, which was a one-night agreement, in the morning she returned the ring and said, no, it won't be happening. Her maids of honor cried all night long and kept her awake, such that she realized that there would be no peace if she went ahead with this French match. It was mostly about the religious issue because Alençon,
the moon,
of course,
methinks, looks with a watery eye.
You've got it. And when she weeps every little flower.
Yep.
And yes. So that was a reference, I believe, that ties Titania even closer to Queen Elizabeth because of that particular incident. Well, how would Shakespeare have known about this negotiation that was going on in 1581? That just makes no sense whatsoever.
That's a really brilliant point, as well as some of the details of the interaction. Not so much just the fact that it's a mockery, because it's possible, and in fact probably very true, that most of the Londoners of the time knew that the Queen was entertaining this idea of marrying this French Catholic. And I'm certain that there had to have been a lot of backlash among just the regular citizenry.
Oh, there was.
So that in itself, the knowledge of it is not so particular, but the ability to mock it and then to do so with such specific detail, that's not going to be found in any level other than the aristocracy, someone of the peerage, who obviously knew some of those inside details.
Absolutely. There's a reference at the very end of the play when Bully Bottom hasn't returned to Athens yet from the forest. He's still in this dream state, when I believe it is Robin Starveling who mentions that, Bully Bottom, he's going to miss his sixpence pension, his sixpence a day. The Duke of Alençon was demanding £60,000 a year as his annuity if he should marry Queen Elizabeth. So the sixpence a day, which is referenced at least 4 or 5 times in a short passage by Moonshine, when the character is going to be paying Moonshine, It was very, very amusing.
Sixpence a day or nothing. He would have 6 pence a day or nothing, I think is what he says.
Well, Alençon was rumored, viciously rumored, to have had syphilis, and that is John Stubbs's gaping golf pamphlet for which he lost his right hand during that whole negotiation. And the negotiation itself was on and off for almost a decade, 9 years actually, but it only really heated up in between 1579 and 1582 when Alençon actually snuck into England on 3 different occasions without permission of the French king to visit the queen and to engage with her. And she would attend on him unchaperoned.
Now, when you say without permission, is it without permission, wink, wink, nudge, nudge?
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, because come on, if it was truly without permission, then it wouldn't have happened 3 times, I don't think.
The French were sending huge delegations of ambassadors. At one point, there were 400 French ambassadors that had come to England to negotiate the peace, the treaty that would support the marriage of Alençon and the Queen. So it was a really big deal. And the people who were really, the nobility opposed to this was led by the Earl of Leicester and Philip Sidney and Walsingham. They were all opposed to this marriage. The Puritans were opposed to it. In support of it was the Earl of Sussex, who was affiliated with the Earl of Oxford, of course, and William Cecil. They were in favor of the French match. So there was this split between the various factions within the courtiers' culture itself that thought that it would be better to have the French match and avoid the French having any alliance with the Spaniards during that time because there was a threat that Spain would come and try to, the Catholic powers would try to overrun England and depose Elizabeth and install Mary Queen of Scots as the new queen, since she was a practicing Catholic at the time. So the religious conflicts were very much in play during those negotiations. But the cult of the Virgin was invented in 1578 and 79 when those negotiations got hot. And the people who were really putting out the masks and all that would build up the image of the Queen's virginity was Philip Sidney. And he produced several masks that before these French delegations to convince them that the Queen was a virgin and she was untouchable from the point of view of marriage.
Even though they had to have known that she was entertaining Alençon unchaperoned in her chambers from time to time.
It goes very deep because the other person that was in play at that time was one of Alençon's ambassadors, Ambassador Jean Simier. Simier was the ultimate French courtier. He was a swordsman. He killed his brother and wife when they betrayed him sexually. So he was a violent person on one level, and yet he was known for mixing love potions. And the story is that Leicester was horrified that the Queen was so happy with these French courtiers around her that he was sure it was the intoxicants that they were feeding her. And of course, that parallels the love potion that they drop into Titania's eyes. And when Oberon describes to Puck what's going to happen when he puts the love potion in her eyes, he says, when she awakes, whatever she sees first, be it a lion or a bear or a boar, a meddling monkey or a busy ape.
Yeah.
Okay? He's referring to those little French courtiers, Alençon and Simier, and she called Simier her ape. Alençon is referred to as the monkey in the Gaping Gulf pamphlet. The King of France referred to his younger brother as the Petit Magot, the little monkey. So the little French monkeys were driving them crazy because of their access to the Queen. And according to Martin Hume, she looked 13 years younger than she was happy and she was very much enjoying their company during this time. And yet she was playing them. Everybody agrees in retrospect that all the anxiety and all the fear that she would actually agree to the wedding was probably misplaced, that she was the consummate wheeler dealer. And the whole point of it was to avoid a match between the Duke and the French Infanta. So there was a lot of politics going on behind.
She's also buying herself time too, right? Because she knows that one of the huge reasons that there would be any encouragement for her to marry at all is to produce an heir. And the longer she waits, the longer she draws this out with this potential suitor, then sooner or later she becomes past childbearing age, and that's not on the table anymore, right?
Right. I mean, she's 18 years older than Alençon. He was in his mid-20s during this negotiation. She was in her early 40s. So there was quite an age difference there also at that time.
She's the original cougar.
She is very much so, you know. So there are other references that tie Alençon to Bottom. Bottom says, I should play it in your French crown color beard, your perfect yellow. So he's talking about costuming himself for his role as Pyramus.
Some of your French crowns have no beard at all, therefore you must play it barefaced, says
right.
Peter Quince.
And Quince's response is reference to a number of things. First of all, the French crown is a term that refers to secondary syphilis, that you would get a eruption along the hairline that would cause hair loss. That was one of the manifestations of secondary syphilis. So
it becomes a dermatological problem, right?
So he's referring to the dermatological, the money, the French crown, and the French crown itself. The fact that he's a nobleman that he's referring to here. So there's three layers in which you can interpret that line. It gives you so how clever Shakespeare was in pointing in direction of this mockery without actually telling you outright that
you
who
can
he's talking
see him like with quill in hand, writing this out, laughing out loud to himself at his own ingenious ability to cleverly paint a picture in three layers with one line.
Well, and his Shakespeare's nomenclature among the rude mechanicals is very relevant in this regard too. First of all, Bottom says he could play Heracles rarely, so Hercules would be identified as a bottom-like association. Francis Flute, well, he was renamed Francois, so Francis Flute is actually a stand-in for him. And at one point, Francis Flute objects to being cast as Thisbe because
I have a beard coming.
A beard coming, and this was a big issue in those negotiations among the French ambassadors. Alençon, like Elizabeth, had smallpox as a child. And it left, unlike with her case, where she had recovered completely without disfigurement, he had pockmarks on his face. And those negotiations include the depths and the size and the number of pockmarks on his face. And one of his ambassadors, Mo de Fenelon, wrote that to Ambassador Dale that he had a beard coming, basically, and it covers up all those disfiguring marks on his face. So that growing a beard would cover up the parts of his face that weren't quite so appealing. So there's so many places in which those identifiers are identified. And the interesting thing, Stephen, is that these associations between Bottom and the Duke of Alençon and Titania and Queen Elizabeth were identified by Eva Turner Clarke in 1930, so almost 100 years ago. This evidence was presented in one of the early Oxfordians' writings. Percy Allen also made these points. And then there's no discussion, there's no interest in this subject, no interest in this allegory, this political allegory, in any of the Shakespearean literature. And then in 1974, Marion Taylor published a book called Bottom, Thou Art Translated. It was published in Europe. But she really reviews this and drills out independently of Eva Turner Clarke's work. So completely independently, she arrived at the same conclusion. And she adds that Edmund Spenser and Philip Sidney were also writing allegorically about the Alençon negotiations and match with Elizabeth. The Mother Hubbard's Tale by Edmund Spenser is a clear attack on Simier and Lord Burleigh as doing things that were unseemly.
With more primate references.
More primate references. There was an ape and a fox in that, and Alençon is not included so much, but Simier is definitely identified as the ape in that narrative. So John Lilly's plays, Sappho and Phao, is about that. In fact, that play was produced just a couple of weeks after the final breakdown of the negotiations, and Alençon was sent off to the continent to fight Elizabeth's proxy war against the Spanish. He was not a great military commander. She gave him a huge amount of money, somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000 pounds for conducting its military operations against the Spanish in the Low Countries, but he was a military failure. Within a year, his whole enterprise had collapsed. The French fury in which he tried to take over Rotterdam was repelled, and he went back to France with his tail between his legs and died at the age of 30 of a broken heart. Elizabeth wore black for 3 weeks after his death and called herself a widow, and was said that she was in mourning for at least the next 6 months.
There are lots of schools of thoughts with regards to her actual relationship with him, but it seems to me that what we can glean from the real historical record we have is that there was some sort of connection between them.
Absolutely.
Even if it was just that they had so many shared experiences, both having suffered smallpox at a younger age, both being of the nobility, both understanding what it's like to be royalty, to be princes of their realms, as it were. And I think that there had to have been like a level of kindredness between them on those regards, whether it was love or not, who knows? But certainly there had to have been a true affection. And though she was a very dramatic persona and knew very well the power of drama, and there's some manipulation in the wearing of black and being a widow, I feel like some of it has to have come from a place of sincerity in her.
Absolutely. She wrote a poem on his departure in 1582 when he went to the continent to fight the wars as her proxy. And it's called To Monsieur on His Departure. And it's the most ambivalent poem you could possibly imagine. I burn and yet I'm cold. And all about the things that she's hot for him and yet she's unable to make a move in his direction. It is an intensely ambivalent poem. And apparently they exchanged love missives that went on right up to the time of his death. Most recently, there was and I know that some of their communications were in code, because scholars recently decoded a letter sent to her from Jean Simier, Ambassador Simier, that said that he looked on her as a god, as perfect as any woman could ever be. And it was only recently translated. So she was exchanging hot love letters with two Frenchmen during this time. It's quite amazing.
Oh, the French.
Well, now, let's look at the bigger picture of what Stratfordian scholars have said about Midsummer Night's Dream and the fact that Elizabeth is definitely alluded to in the passage in which Oberon says this: flying between the cold moon and earth, Cupid, all armed, a certain aim he took at a fair vestal throned by the west, and loosed his love shaft smartly from his bow, as it should pierce 100,000 hearts. But I might see Cupid's fiery shaft quenched in the chaste beams of the watery moon, and the imperial votaress passed on in maiden meditation, fancy free.
Mm-hmm.
Scholars universally agree that is a reference. The throned vestal in the west is the
Virgin Queen.
The Virgin Queen. The most obvious reference to the Queen in the entire Shakespeare canon, according to most scholars.
One of the other things that I love about that particular passage, too, is then right after that, he says that the shaft, missing the Queen, lands upon a small flower and turns it from white to purple.
Right.
Which in my mind is a direct connection and correlation to Venus and Adonis.
It certainly seems that way, don't you think?
I would think so.
Yeah. And I think many scholars would see Elizabeth as being represented by Venus in that narrative, which is a very troubling interpretation.
It is a very troubling interpretation, isn't it? But you can't deny that the correlation is there. And here you have a writer making reference to an earlier work that is connected to this same woman, and in my mind, in a romantic way. And I say then that puts Oberon in the place of the writer's voice.
I think you're absolutely right about that. I think Oberon does represent the writer in this play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so all the more reason why he would attack and satirize this challenging Frenchman to the love of his life, perhaps.
I think he had deeply ambivalent relationships with Alençon. Ostensibly, his faction within the court was supporting of the marriage, and yet in 1580, 81, 82, when this was going on, Oxford was in, he had been banished from court.
He was in hot water.
He had been in hot water in 81. He was in the Tower of London during part of this time, and under house arrest, banished from court for that 2-year period of time because of his impregnating Anne Vavasor. So he would have been an outlier in this, and he would have been, I think, very motivated to try to represent it in some way that got back. The Duke, who was the Queen's favorite during that time, since he was so out of favor. But when you take that speech, you look at other ways of interpreting that, and Stephen Greenblatt is probably the most notorious interpreter of that image of the Queen, the fair vestal thrown by the west, in Shakespeare's Will in the World. He says that Shakespeare's sense of the transforming power of theatrical illusions may be traced back to what he heard about or saw for himself in 1575 at Kenilworth. His sense of the coarse reality that lies beneath the illusions may well have go back to that festive moment. In other words, he's saying that his inspiration for writing like about Oberon, and there are images that arise from that Kenilworth celebration that kind of point at Midsummer Night's Dream, and yet more recently, Helen Hackett writing in Shakespeare and Elizabeth, the meeting of the merging of two myths, says The possible connection between Oberon's vision and Elizabeth at Kenilworth has been one of the most enduring and important elements of the double myth of Shakespeare and Elizabeth. Its history illustrates how that myth has crossed boundaries between academic scholarship, fiction, and popular culture, as many different kinds of readers and writers and custodians and customers of the heritage industry have taken a shared pleasure and satisfaction in the idea that Shakespeare's first inspiration came from the magnificent, spectacular figure of Elizabeth and the pageants in her honor. So, she definitely, like I said, she understood the power of drama, and she understood the power of pageantry and perception being all. Yes. So they would rather have us look at the Kenilworth celebration in 1575. We have no documentary evidence that Shakespeare ever made it to that, nor is there any strong evidence that actually impacted Midsummer Night's Dream. And in avoiding altogether the discussion of whether this is a subtle commentary on the sexual politics of that era involving the Duke and the Queen and his entourage. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention is that Alençon's primary negotiator early on during this thing was a French ambassador by the name of Mo de Fenelon, M-O-T-H-E. Now, Moth is one of the fairies, right? Mm-hmm. And his next ambassador was Ambassador de Quincy, Q-U-I-N-C-Y, pronounced de Quincy, but that could be a stand-in for Peter Quince, who, of course, is the stage manager of this. Snout, is another one of the rude mechanicals. He may be named after Dubec, who is the secretary of Alençon that had accompanied him on his voyages across the English Channel to visit Elizabeth. So
Snout the Tinker.
Yeah. So the rude mechanicals are in some ways named for the ambassadors that were part of Alençon's entourage during those negotiations.
Well, and there's also that other layer of symbolism too, and like you said, Bottom the Weaver,
right,
and Snout the Tinker. He's tinkering with what's going on in the political realm, and Peter Quince the planer.
That's it. And of course, Robin Starveling,
the tailor.
Now, Robin Starveling, I think, is named after the Earl of Leicester, Elizabeth's other suitor, who was closest to her early on in her career. Her familiar name to him was Robin. Her sweet Robin. Robin Starveling gets to play Moonshine, which is another reflection on Elizabeth. So I think that the idea that Robin is starving out there for affection, because it was Ambassador Simier that outed the Earl of Leicester for having married Lettice Knollys without the Queen's permission.
Right.
Which then she put him under house arrest and immediately agreed to the Alençon match the next day. So it was, and then of course, the Earl of Leicester was furious with Ambassador Simier. He twice tried to have him assassinated. One time in a barge that were going down the Thames River, and somebody shot a musket ball across the bow of the boat, trying to aim it at Simier. But of course, it was very close to the Queen. They did not go very well. But there were several attempts to assassinate Simier by Leicester's people.
And so what you're pointing out here is that within the story of the Mechanicals,
yes,
is this very interesting love triangle.
Yeah.
Oh, but wait a minute. The main story of the play, P.S., happens to be a love triangle.
Yes.
Go figure.
Well, Theseus, Hippolyta, Hermia, Helena, Demetrius, Lysander, all those names come right out of Plutarch, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think of the classical sources, Ovid's Metamorphoses and Heroides are among the primary sources. But Plutarch certainly plays a role, because Theseus is well described in Parallel Lives as the founder of Athens, and the person who was very, very significant in the creation of the whole Athenian, dominance in the Aegean. That he, defeated the Minotaur and was the original hero besides Hercules, who was a kinsman of him. Of course, and Hercules is referenced 3 times in the play, but the Hippolyta, of course, the queen of the Amazons, and it was Hercules that captured her belt as part of his labors. So that's all tied together.
And she uses that in jealousy,
yes,
against Theseus too, right? So I was with Hercules in Cadmus once.
That's right. Well,
and his hounds.
And she recounts all the women that Theseus, betrayed, Ariadne and others that had bad outcomes.
Antiopa.
In relationship with him. And that comes right out of Plutarch. And the other two characters that come right out of Plutarch that's very interesting is Lysander and Demetrius. Who was Lysander? He was the admiral that ran the Spartan fleet that defeated the Athenians at the end of the Peloponnesian War at Ephesus. So at Ephesus, which of course turns up in the canon in several stories, but Lysander was the man who finally defeated the Athenians at the end of the Peloponnesian War, but saved Athens because the Corinthians and the other allies of the Spartans were all set to burn Athens and to kill all the men and to sell all the women and children to slavery, and basically end Athens as a cultural or political entity. And Lysander said, no, the Athenians stood up against the Persians at Marathon. And they are worthy, and we'll change their form of government, but we're not going to sell all their women and children to slavery and kill all the men because they're much better than that. And who was Demetrius? Well, he was a son of Antigonus I, who inherited Alexander the Great's throne in Macedonia, and he saved Athens from Cassander and Ptolemy about 100 years after the Peloponnesian War ended. And the Athenians erected a temple in his honor, and Demetrius, they honored him as a god almost. So Lysander had a huge statue of himself put up at the Oracle of Delphi. So Lysander and Demetrius are known for characters, warrior characters, who saved Athens historically. That comes right out of Plutarch. So it's very interesting to me how Shakespeare historicizes and characterizes his fictional characters.
So I'm wondering, in a play that has so many characters that are arguably, but in my mind, I agree with you, based on real people who lived and who were in and around court at the time, who do you figure Hermia, Demetrius, Lysander, Helena, who do those four represent?
Well, Hermia as the daughter of Aegeus, who's who refuses to marry Demetrius, her father's choice. In my mind, she represents Elizabeth Vere, the oldest daughter of the Earl of Oxford, because they were estranged for the first 5 years of her life because of his belief that she was not of his own blood, that his wife had committed adultery, and when he was in Europe and bore him a child that was not his. They were eventually reconciled, and of course they went on to have 2 more daughters and other pregnancies that did not result in surviving children. But I think that the fact that he rejected his daughter early on in his life and now is perhaps for her wedding, has written this play, which is an apology of sorts, because Aegeus has to deal with the fact that Hermia will make her own choice as to her husband, and she's willing to sacrifice her community, her family, and everything to be with the man that she loves. I think these are like Greek romance characters. It's new comedy that's plotting, or like you see in some of the other plays like Comedy of Errors and others, where you have these mistaken identities and all, the love potion being, of course, the one that tricks everybody into the chaos that ensues in the forest. So I'm not quite sure who the other characters would represent in this mix, but I have affection for Hermia as a representative of Elizabeth Vere.
I often point out, and one of the things that I love about Hermia is her strength as a female character.
Yes.
In one of the earliest pieces of literature where you have a woman who stands up to this patriarchal society and says no, like stamps her foot and says, no, I will not abide. I will run away if I have to, in order to avoid and get out from underneath the thumb of these 2 men, my father and the Duke, who are going to force me to do something I don't want to do. And I find that to be such a liberating character. She's personified somewhat as sort of a spoiled brat to some degree, and who always gets her way. But nonetheless, what she stands up against is pretty monumental when you think about it in terms of literature, a character of that nature.
Absolutely. I think that her perseverance through the forest, despite being betrayed, by Lysander and, abandoned by Demetrius, who had been pursuing her relentlessly previously. And then the conflict she experiences with Helena, coming to blows, is really tests her courage, her determination, and it all works out in the end. So, but really, you are quite right. She's an extraordinary, one of Shakespeare's wonderful comic characters, who's a very successful woman in her own right and empowered.
Now, and of course, later on in life, long after Susan, we get, first you have Elizabeth, right?
And then Bridget, and then Susan.
Bridget, and Susan's the youngest.
Yes.
And Susan's the one who does argue later on in life to marry the man that she loves and not the man that everyone wants her to marry, and actually is granted that right. She does get to marry the man that she loves, a commoner, right? And he was a soldier, I want to say. Isn't that correct?
Susan marries the Earl of Montgomery.
Then is it Bridget who marries?
She marries Lord Norris, excuse me. So they all married into the aristocracy. It was the mother, the Earl of Oxford's mother, that married a commoner.
Well, which of the three daughters, it's either Bridget or Susan, who refuses the first choice, though, and says, I want to marry this guy. And it turns out really bad for her, though, right? Because her husband ends up committing suicide later on in life as well, isn't it?
I'm not too familiar with that end of the story. I'm thinking that the negotiations for Elizabeth's marriage to the Earl of Southampton was hung up. In other words, originally Elizabeth Vere they were negotiating, and Lord Burleigh, as her grandfather, and the head of the Court of Wards, who has some control over who Southampton would marry, since he was a ward of the court at that time. Southampton was obliged to pay a £5,000 fine for not marrying Elizabeth Vere. And he went on later to marry Elizabeth Vernon many years later. But then then when those negotiations were terminated because Southampton wouldn't go along with it, she ended up marrying William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby.
Then it's definitely Bridget, who is the daughter who refuses to marry the first choice, or who they want her to marry, and argues that she wants to marry for love, and it ends terribly for her. And that also is reflected, I believe, in Cymbeline with the character of Imogen.
Well, you have so many father-daughter wounded relationships that are being healed by these plays. I mean, you have in Pericles, who's lost his daughter for 13 years. In Leontes, in The Winter's Tale, loses his daughter for 16 years. And Imogen is lost to her father, the king, for a period of time. They're estranged from each other. You have Aegeus and Hermia here. So the theme of the wounded relationship between the father and otherwise strong and healthy daughters comes up over and over and over again in the canon. And I think this is a reflection in some ways of Oxford's own personal acts of redemption, of his own rejection of his legitimate daughter. And of course, those of you who are listening are probably familiar with the bed tricks that are represented in several of Shakespeare's plays, in Measure for Measure and in All's Well, and the fact that there are two historical documents that suggest Cecil de Vere pulled the same trick on the Earl of Oxford, two separate historical documents. So it's a bit like a soap opera. For instance, Anne Cecil was originally negotiating to be married, her father, to Philip Sidney, and somehow that broke down at the time that the Earl of Oxford came along. So those negotiations were a bit fluid, apparently.
And writing characters like these women, like Hermia even, and Juliet also, who stands up to her father in the face of violence, right? Like, it's very clear in the text, especially the way the scansion reads, where the action points, where the Caesarea exist in that scene, and with the responses of the other two women in the room, Lady Capulet and the nurse, that he has struck her, and that he's threatening to strike her again, and strikes the nurse as well. And in the face of that kind of violence and the threat of being thrown out in the street, Juliet still holds her ground and still stands up to the patriarchy. And I've always been one who've argued, and those of you who are familiar with the program, you've heard me say it before, I've always argued a man who writes characters like that definitely makes sure his daughters know how to read characters like that.
Yes.
And we all know the man from Stratford's daughters could not read.
Well, one marked with, one could, I think, sign her name, but the other one signed with a mark.
Right.
So we have no other documentation. And the one who could sign her name actually could not read or identify her husband's writing, his Latin medical notes.
Right.
Yeah. So
there's a huge disconnect in the whole history of that story. But if you look at it from the Oxfordian perspective, you see not only strong female characters that now these strong women, these daughters of his, can read and appreciate and enjoy, but also these strong three daughters who in many ways are models for the very characters that we're talking about.
Absolutely. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is indeed.
Yeah. Well, you started off the conversation talking about the flowers in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I want to mention something about the birds in Midsummer Night's Dream. There's over a dozen different species of birds mentioned in this, and of course, they aren't the kind of birds you would expect in a tragedy. They don't have any eagles or ravens mentioned. They're all songbirds and wonderful love kind of birds, that are featured. And in my mind, this is a pointer that suggests that Shakespeare may be playing off of Aristophanes' most famous play, The Birds, which of course was not translated into English or even Latin. That was published in England during Shakespeare's lifetime. But the hero of The Birds is a man named Pistheterus, an Athenian who's gone in exile from Athens. He doesn't like life there. There's too much litigiousness going on. He and a friend go off and they encounter the birds and have a whole series of somewhat terrifying moments. But then they argue to the birds that they are actually the progenitors of everything that's valuable, that they should be the gods, that Cupid was the original progenitor of all the birds and that they should dominate the Olympians. And so they build Cloud Cuckoo Land, Cuckoo Nebulopolis, and they deny all the offerings that have been made to the god to go up to Mount Olympus. So the gods are starving. They send Hercules and Poseidon and a barbarian down to negotiate. And finally, Pistheterus, who's now sprouted wings, he's metamorphized just like Bottom was, is able to successfully claim the scepter of Zeus and marries his beautiful daughter Basilia. And so you have a commoner who goes in exile into a wilderness, gets transformed, and marries basically the daughter of the king of heaven, So it's quite a remarkable story. And I believe the references to the birds in both those plays is very significant. And of course, Aristophanes is writing political, allegorical satires and burlesques of the most important and famous people in Athens at the time. His license, his poetic license was unfettered. That he attacked Cleon, he attacked Pericles, he attacked Socrates. There was nobody that was of any consequence in Athens during his lifetime when he was writing plays that didn't come under his pen at one time in a mocking allegory.
You would better have a bad epithet than their ill report while you live.
That's it.
Right? From Hamlet, when he's talking about the players.
That's it.
Yeah. So there you have it. These are the guys you don't want to be on the receiving end of in that case, the pen is mightier than the sword, right?
Yeah. Well, I would refer people to that article in Brief Chronicles 6 that I detailed the parallels between Aristophanes' most famous play, The Birds, and Shakespeare's most popular comedy, Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yeah, and you're right. And it's even Puck uses a lot of those bird references, including when he's describing what happens with the mechanicals after he converts Bottom to the ass. Right. He describes them as birds flying away at the gun's report. Right.
Yes,
I believe he uses choughs, which is not a very common bird name that most people are aware of.
No.
But that same bird, choughs, ends up in Macbeth as well.
That's right.
He references the choughs in that storyline as well.
Yeah.
So Aristophanes. Okay, but what you just said is that Aristophanes during the Elizabethan age was not available in Latin, definitely not in English. So the only known copies at that time are in their original Greek.
Well, there would have been continental editions and translations of Aristophanes' plays that were published in Basel and Paris and
so French.
They would have not been vernacular. They would have been Latin translations for the most part. There were a handful of vernacular translations of the Greek classical dramatists from Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides. Aristophanes, because he was so topical, didn't interest the Renaissance translators nearly so much because it was all political and commentaries that were of social and political forces that were going on in Athens.
How would someone during that period of time get their hands on a copy?
Well, we know that the Earl of Oxford's tutor, Sir Thomas Smith, produced the Plutus and two of the plays of Aristophanes were produced in Greek at Cambridge University, at Queen's College, Cambridge, where he was an official. And so it was The Peace and the Plutus were the two Aristophanes plays that were produced in Greek at Cambridge University. So, but other than that, we don't have any evidence that there was a popular Greek translation project going on.
Who would the players have been? Who would the actors have been in this Greek performance?
They were undergraduates, students who were studying Greek at Cambridge University. But Thomas Smith, of course, would have had copies of all these plays in his personal library, and we don't know exactly how long. But the Earl of Oxford did live as a tutored by Thomas Smith early on in the years right before his father died, and he went as a ward of the court at the age of 12 to William Cecil's home in the Strand in London.
And then his later subsequent tutor, to some degree, becomes his uncle Arthur Golding.
That's right. Of course, Ovid's Metamorphoses is the source for the whole story of Pyramus and Thisbe. And of course, it's a burlesque also of the tragic Romeo and Juliet story.
Of course.
So he's playing off his own tragical lines. And that is a mark of Aristophanic comedy, is to use the language and the style and the narrative plots of great tragedy, but to mock it. And that was one of Aristophanes' significant gifts. And he would do it with language. And if you look at Bottom's language, the lovers are more condoling, and everything he says is a malapropism of some type or another. He's really remarkable in that regard.
Yeah, well, some of the best characters in the canon are those with the best use of malapropism, right? Between him and Dogberry, those are obviously the two big ones, the two favorites of them all. I think there's a man of the cloth, the preacher in Merry Wives of Windsor, the Welshman, Sir Hugh.
Yeah.
Who has some issues, but his is more like language driven. There's Dr. Caius, the Frenchman, who also has the same thing, but they're more language disconnects than they are just ignorance. Whereas Dogberry and Bottom are just, guys who are trying to sound smarter than they are and totally blowing it left and right.
Absolutely. In my paper, I talk about the fact that Bottom is actually a comedic Herculean hero. An author by the name of Waite wrote a book about the Herculean hero in Shakespeare, Dryden, Marlowe, and Chapman, and looks only at the tragical elements. He talks about Coriolanus and Mark Antony as being tragic Herculean heroes. But Benedict in Much Ado About Nothing and Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream both represent, in their own ways, remarkable evidence of their model on a comedic Herculean model.
They both reference Hercules in their text as well. They both have lines where they reference Hercules.
Well, Bottom says, I could play Hercules.
Right. And I believe Benedict talks about Hercules' Massey Club in one of his speeches.
That's right. And so there's the Hercules, the characteristic of his being represented as a comedic character. For instance, in Euripides, Alcestis and his Ion, in The Birds, among other ones. He's all in about half the Greek canon. He's represented for humor in comedies or in a comedic kind of way. And Bottom fulfills that. I mean, he's so self-confident. He plays any role he wants. He wants to play the lion, the lover, the lady. He'll play any role you give him. He's Herculean in that regard. There's no question of his self-confidence and his ability to transition. They put the ass's head on him, and he starts singing a bird song, and he wakes up Titania, and suddenly he's being, and he's ordering the fairies around to bring him a good bottle of hay, So
who doesn't enjoy a good bottle of hay?
I mean, Hercules is known for his gluttony, his sexual appetite, and his burlesquing around as in a ridiculous, foolish way in so many ways. And so I think Bottom fits that model very well, and he's designed specifically to be a Herculean style hero, and of course one of the most charming and amusing characters in the entire canon.
Well, and it definitely lends itself to the idea that the author had to have been versed in some way in a capacity greater than most.
Oh, absolutely.
With regards to familiarity with the Greeks. And
well, I looked at I took a you might say a sideways look at the canon, and identified all the references to Hercules. There are about 35 in the entire canon. They're really loaded in Love's Labour's Lost. There's like six references to Hercules, and he actually, one of the characters shows up as Hercules holding the snakes. That were sent. Juno sent to him to kill him early on in his life because he was a bastard child of Zeus, of course. So he has all these wonderful references to Hercules. The first and second labors, the 11th and 12th labors, the Nessus shirt. There's just a remarkable excursion of Hercules' knowledge.
The Nemean lion that is mentioned several times.
Oh yeah, I mean, these references come up over and over again. And when you look at the sources by which Shakespeare must have been familiar with, you would have to include Ovid and Plutarch and Apollodorus and Diodorus and Lucian. And you look at the panoply of sources that he had to have known to represent these in the various plays. It shows you the breadth of his knowledge of the Hercules myths that most scholars miss completely.
Well, we can tell our listeners too, if obviously they have found our program and they're regular listeners, that they are our fond quillers. But if you want to learn a little bit more about Greek mythology, you can go to another podcast series held right here on this same network, Dragon Wagon Radio, called Myth Understood. And it's one of the popular podcasts on the network, Myth Understood. And you'll find all kinds of episodes there that dissect and take apart some of the great myths of the world and throughout history. So there's another tie-in there for if you're looking for another new podcast, go visit Dragon Wagon Radio and find some other fun stuff there. But I think that the key becomes in this discussion is not only have you pointed out very clearly that there had to have been some kind of knowledge of the Greek masters. I say it has to be an advanced knowledge in order to be able to pull it apart this way and to use these references and to satirize. In order to really truly create farce or satire of a topic or a subject, you have to know it. You have to know it deeply, inside and out, or the references don't make sense. You'll miss the mark. It won't be funny.
Yes.
And I think that when you write a play like that, you're writing to an audience who has to get those jokes.
Right.
And if they don't, certainly the common people are going to find Bottom funny.
Right.
But the courtiers are going to find him hilarious because they get it. They have the inside edge. They have the knowledge. They have the education to be able to understand the play at a whole different level and appreciate the wit at a whole different level.
Well, John Harrington, in I think 1602, he made a comment, it's recorded, that allegorical lock-picking had become a court pastime obsession, that people were obsessed with it. And William Cecil himself wrote that no one could decipher the allegory any better than Queen Elizabeth herself, that she fully expected to be represented in these dramas, and that whether she ever saw A Midsummer Night's Dream or simply read it, because it was published before her death, it was published in 1598, would have been dying of laughter at this mocking of her romance. And even she, according to historian Stephen Buyansky, acknowledged that this was a protracted soap opera from start to finish, that it was the most comedic historical negotiation in the entire English history.
Well, and if you believe, as I do, that it was Edward de Vere writing this play,
yes,
then you have to go, where my brain goes is, okay, I can see him in my mind's eye sitting there writing some of these scenes, some of these passages. And like I mentioned before, laughing out loud, knowing how much she's going to laugh out loud. And then being at that first court performance where she witnesses for the first time. And as many of us producer directors will do, like for me, when I produce a play, I like to sit in the very back row of the theater. I'm not watching the play anymore. I've been watching the play for weeks. I've seen it enough times. I'm the director. Now I'm watching the audience response to see if they're actually responding the way I anticipated they would or that they might in directing the play. And I could just imagine him sitting there watching her the entire time, hoping that she's going to find things as funny as he hoped she would, and dreading if she doesn't.
Yes. Well, Tom Stoppard certainly took advantage of that in the final in Shakespeare in Love when he puts Queen Elizabeth up in the galleries, which of course she never went to the Globe to see.
Of course
it play.
not.
But yes, and it's a funny thing I'm thinking of now that the Earl of Oxford was known to have been performed in a play in 1581 before the French ambassadors. That's the time that he refused to dance for the ambassadors because the Queen had insulted the Earl of Sussex. But there was a play that they put on, Murderous Michael, on Shrove Tuesday in 1579, when the Earl of Sussex's company put on the play the device by the Earls of Oxford and Surrey and Lord Thomas Howard and Lord Windsor before the French ambassador and Simier, Alençon's representative in the French marriage negotiations, a Morris mask prepared but not danced. And that reminds me of Bonne's offering to do a Bergamask at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream.
Would you like to hear an epilogue or perhaps a Bergamask dance?
No Bergamask dance.
No.
So this is the
leave your epilogue alone.
So the Earl of Oxford didn't dance for the French, and Bottom's not going to dance for Theseus's court. So there's parallels everywhere in this play that must have been very amusing to the courtiers who were familiar with these negotiations, knew about the Earl of Oxford, possibly as the author, and very secretly enjoying this. And we know we have so many more records of court performances of Shakespeare's plays as opposed to public performances. We have recordings of performances at the Bull and places like that of, in Henslow's diary, of course.
I think it's important to point that out and to repeat that, because I think a lot of listeners maybe aren't aware that that is a fact, that there are far more written, documented evidence, specific moments where people documented that they saw these plays and they saw them in places where only a select group of invited individuals would have been able to see them.
Right.
Not in the public theaters, not at the Rose, not at the Globe, not at the public theater, but in somebody's chamber, in somebody's dining hall, in the great hall of this person's home or that person's estate, or in this castle. Right. And I think that that's something that needs to be emphasized again and again and again for listeners out there to realize that these plays saw the light of day first for a very select audience, and the author knew exactly who was going to be in attendance on the night of opening night.
I think that's a fair argument. I think Richard Dutton, in his book Shakespeare Court Dramatist, would argue a slightly different mechanism by which the extended court performances were created. It's his belief that some of these plays were performed on the public stage in a more truncated forms and shortened forms, and then they were rewritten and expanded. You'd compare Hamlet for Q1 to Hamlet Q2. There's quite a change between those two versions of the play, and that the latter versions, the more complex, elaborate literary versions, were the ones that were performed at court. That a court performance could go on for 4 or 5 hours. That the court would be prepared. They would be seated rather than standing, of course, as they are more in the public stage, and they would be indoors as opposed to being outdoors. And so the possibility of doing a full text representation of these plays with a more elaborate, more literary text as the script was that's Dutton's theory. Now, I think it could go either way, that these were either foreshortened and cut for public performances or expanded for court performances, but there's no question that the literary qualities of these plays are deep, self-consciously integrated into this in the beautiful mimetic way that Shakespeare does, combining Renaissance and classical and medieval sources in his great canon, and that the literati would have understood it far better than the people who were not educated.
And when you know that the Queen is going to be the center focus of the audience, when you know she's sitting front row center, it changes what you write. It has to change what you write. When you know that next to her is going to be William Cecil Lord Burleigh on one side and whoever else is on the other side, maybe Francis Walsingham is on the other side, and you know that these other earls, you know that Sidney's going to be in the audience, and that you know that Christopher Hatton is going to be in the audience. When you know
curse that guy,
right? When you know they're going to be there, and when you know that you can write a joke that is going to make her laugh at their expense,
yes,
you win. You totally win,
yeah.
right? And as long as she's laughing, it doesn't matter how pissed off they are. she's laughing.
Yes, but that does make you a very dangerous character, doesn't it?
It does make you a very hated, dangerous character.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think Oxford did have intensely ambivalent relationship with the Queen, that he lacked the monopolies that she gave to others. He became impoverished by the way she distributed his properties during his wardship under Cecil, that Leicester ripped him off pretty much, that his impoverishment was partly due, at least according to Nina Green, to the manipulations of the court and the Court of Wards and the fines he didn't pay and the accrued interest and all this sort of stuff. So he was the most downwardly mobile Englishman in all of history, according to Roger Strittmatter, and I kind of believe that. So there was some resentment, I think, over Oxford's not being given more military commissions, being given more monopolies or some other means by which he could obtain his financial security. And then, of course, he did get the £1,000 annuity starting in 1586 that went on for the next 18 years until his death. So there was some compensation coming from the Queen, but I know that he was trying to please her, but it was very difficult and he did not get her favor in many ways.
Well, I would think that it's easy to have a love-hate relationship with your sovereign.
Yes.
Because especially somebody who is holding the second oldest title in the realm, who does have a very strong penchant for duty to crown and country. And I think that would then further lend itself to that ambivalence that you talk about, right? I love you as the sovereign of my country because I'm a true Englishman, but I hate that you're such a bitch. Like that has to be part of it. I think also if you look at it, ever more in subjection.
Yes.
And so take it from her perspective, and I'm a firm believer that she needed him to be her propagandist. I work in PR and marketing, right? My day job, they call me the spin doctor. Yeah. When you need someone to do that job who doesn't want to do that job, instead he wants to go off and fight a war, or he wants to go off and have a tin monopoly, or he wants to go off and party, because he did a lot of that. If you keep him dependent, right? Yeah. You are now controlling him.
Yeah.
Right. If he's dependent on you for the cash, then he has to do what you need him to do to give you the cash. And in my theory, that £1,000 annuity is you're going to be my propagandist, and I'm going to pay you to be my propagandist, and you don't get money otherwise.
Well, you look at the Henry VI trilogy, or that began being written in the early 1590s. At least we think that the date of those plays would be among the very earliest plays. Well, what was the Earl of Oxford's family situation at that time? Well, both his brother-in-law, the Peregrine Bertie, Lord Willoughby, and his first cousin, Francis Vere, were in France fighting against the French Catholics in support of Henry IV, the Huguenot. So he had personal connections in France, fighting with English army that was not being paid by Elizabeth. She denied payment to the number of the soldiers that were in those campaigns. So in Henry VI, when the soldiers campaign, what they lack is men and materials and money, that raising funds to support the wars in France was a deeply important political issue in England right at the time that those Henry VI plays are being written. Well, the English forces are at that time, most people don't think of it that way. They think that we're fighting the Spanish, but they're actually fighting the French Catholics in support of Henry of Navarre, who eventually converts to Catholicism, much to Elizabeth's dismay, and then the civil wars in France end basically when he agrees to convert to Catholicism. So it's very interesting to me that Shakespeare's writing plays that point out the terrible things that happened during Civil War and disruption, and what a weak king can cause in terms of the search for power, and that there was some political motive there. But of course, as Elizabeth, as a tutor, the idea that Richard III, the Duke of Gloucester in Henry VI Part 3 is depicted as such an evil character, such a murdering character that is ahistorical, of course, as Thomas More and Hall and Holinshead that kind of set that in motion as political propaganda in the Chronicles, that Shakespeare underlined that and amplified it even more in those plays. So clearly, I agree with you that in that 1590s and those history plays were certainly being written as political propaganda in terms of augmenting the legitimacy of the Tudor realm.
Would he write them? Would he need that £1,000 annuity if she had granted him the other things he had asked for during his lifetime, such as the tin monopoly that he lobbied for so often, for so long, and never received? You got to keep him. You got to keep him dependent on the government.
Well, his engagement with the theater long predated that annuity. I mean, he was involved with theater in the early 1580s. Years before the annuity came along, he had 2 acting companies, Oxford's Boys and Oxford's Men. The boys performed at court in 1584. They did the history of Agamemnon and Ulysses, possibly an early rendition of Troilus and Cressida. They also did Campaspe, John Lilly's play. And there's a reference to a Timon, the Athenian Misanthropos biting on the stage. So a Timon satire was also referenced in 1584. So I think the Earl of Oxford was very involved in the theater culture early on, even before the annuity came along. But perhaps you're right that annuity in his poverty did force him to become more of a dependent on the writing.
Well, and there again, you're making another argument for why she would refuse him certain things as well. Yeah, you haven't shown a propensity for spending money wisely, sir. Yet you're asking me to give you more money, right? So you're off partying with these theater people. You've surrounded yourself with these less than desirable members of society, Monday and Lily and the rest of them, and yet you want me to give you the tin monopoly, or you want me to give you these lands, or you want me to give you a commission to be master of the horse in this campaign. But you haven't demonstrated the type of responsibility that I look for when I grant these things. What you have shown is a propensity for wildness and frivolity and debauchery, and your true love isn't any of these things. Your true love is the theater. So if I'm going to pay you for anything, I'm going to pay you for that. And here's what I need, and here's what I want.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And of course, England was coming under a huge amount of pressure at that time in the war economy that was descending following the Spanish Armada in 1588. Over the next decade, the cost of bread tripled and taxes went way out to pay for the war effort. The war with Spain went on for 20 years, just the defeat of the army in 1588, following the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. But here's what's happening right then is when the plays start showing up. 1589, you've got the first references to productions of Hamlet. You've got Titus Andronicus, Love's Labour's Lost, and the Henry VI plays showing up in the early 1590s. So there's a whole profusion of plays that are coming along right in the aftermath of the beginning of that war. And I think that if you look at the question of Hamlet, why was Hamlet so important at that time? Hamlet is a play that justifies justifiable regicide. Okay, you can kill Claudius because of what he's done to the kingdom, what he did to your father. There's a legitimacy in killing him. And that may be a parallel to the legitimizing the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, that it would show that there are certain times when a God-anointed person on a throne could be dethroned and executed justifiably. So I think that Hamlet may reflect those values, and there are scholars who have suggested that that's a topical allusion to Mary Queen of Scots.
And so then conversely, he says, okay, yes, I will write you your Henry VI plays, or I will write you your Henry IV plays, or I will write Henry V. I will write Richard III to be the greatest villain of all time. But I'm also going to give you A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yes. Well, King James, of course, had great pleasure in the Shakespeare productions. In the first season that he was on the throne, they performed 7 or possibly even 8 different Shakespeare plays during that first festival season. If you think the Spanish Maze may have been the first title for The Tempest, but there were 7 other individual Shakespeare plays that were performed at court. They did Merchant of Venice twice on royal command. So I think that that was, of course, the year that the Susan Vere, the youngest daughter of the Earl of Oxford, married the Earl of Montgomery, one of the brethren to whom the first folio was dedicated. So another family connection there. And that King James was incredibly fond of this couple, that he actually came into their bedroom in the morning after their nuptials and hung out with them in their bedroom and asked them how things went. So So
Wow.
James was connected to this group of people.
And
who
which
had,
one of them was he really interested in going to bed with, or was it just a quick menage a trois there with the king?
Well, Oxford's oldest daughter, Elizabeth, there had some notoriety. There was some question whether she had an affair with the Earl of Essex or Walter Raleigh, because there was rumors of this, which, her husband, William Stanley, probably wouldn't have liked that very much at all. So again, the soap opera may be going on even within the Earl of Oxford's family.
Well, I think that one of the things that we have to constantly remember about all of this is that there is that layer, there is that level of court intrigue that we are so specifically aware of through the historical record and through the things that have been proven, as well as the things that have maybe not been quite so proven. But it's not hard to look at and see the Queen's history with her courtiers, both real and imagined. Whether it is Leicester and that whole marriage thing with him getting married against her will and then his wife mysteriously dying and that aspect, right?
Yes.
And then, especially with Essex and the familiarity and the once love they had to have had for him to feel emboldened enough to burst into her bedchambers the way that it basically ended his whole life.
This did not happen once with the Earl of Essex. He was actually one of the commanders of the French English expedition in the 1590s and came back summoned to Elizabeth's court and burst in on her several other occasions. So he had a habit of doing this.
Yeah, you don't do that unless you've been there plenty of times,
Yes.
otherwise invited,
Yeah.
right? Like, it means, and then we hear, the whole stories about Alençon and him being in her bedchambers and without any quote unquote chaperone. There's a lot of stuff going on in between people's sheets and behind closed doors throughout that entire age and era. And I believe that when you look at Measure for Measure, for instance, what you're looking at is Edward de Vere saying to them all, you're all hypocrites. You're all doing it. You all know you're doing it. I got caught and I had to go to the Tower for it, but you're all just as damn guilty as I am. And I believe that's what that whole play is about.
Oh, I love it when you're so righteous, Stephen.
Yeah, well, there you go. I mean,
All right.
read the play with that idea in mind and tell me if you disagree. That's what I would say to anybody.
Now, I would say to everybody who's listening, come to Ashland October 1st through the 4th for the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference. On the first day of our program, we will be seeing a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream at the Bomer Theater on October 1st. And we will have discussions that follow the lines that we've been talking about today. And the show is being directed by Joseph Hodge, who is the artistic director of the Guthrie Theater in Minnesota. So I want you all to think about saddling your ponies up and coming to Ashland in October and enjoying our conference.
You can find out all the details that you need at ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. That's ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. All the conference information is there with the dates, the hotel information, the plays that we will be seeing that will also be part of the focus of the conference presentations throughout that weekend. So if you are interested in learning more and being entertained at the same time, it's a great opportunity to come and enjoy the full immersion of 150 or more scholars from throughout the world who will be there descending on Ashland to enjoy the plays, to enjoy conversation and camaraderie, and if I may, fellowship.
Absolutely.
On this topic and many others. We want to thank you, Earl, for joining us again here. You now hold the record as the most popular guest with the most appearances on Don't Quill the Messenger. And we'll, of course, have to have you back again for another episode on another topic. And we want to remind everyone to please give us rates and reviews at your favorite streaming site. Let the world know what you think about this podcast series. And we'll always accept your emails too. Fire us an email with your comments, your suggestions. We love to hear them. Even the naysayers. Yes, we'll do an entire episode just on you, I promise. So go ahead, send us your critiques as well. Thank you for joining us once again on Don't Quill the Messenger. And remember, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.